Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. You're watching a live stream from the Chicago Composers Orchestra. My name is Randall West. I am CCO's Artistic Director. We're really happy to share music with you virtually, even though we can't do so in person. I even put a tie on today. I don't remember the last time I wore a tie. The Chicago Composers Orchestra is a contemporary music orchestra based in Chicago. Our mission is to present orchestral music by living composers, to extend the orchestral tradition, to make it open, vibrant, and diverse, and to speak to our lives today. What you just saw and heard was a graphic score by San Francisco-based composer Joseph Colombo. And the musicians that you heard and are hearing throughout the broadcast tonight are Dalia Chin on flute, Becca Dora on oboe, Sean Flynn on clarinet, Yvonne Garcia on violin, Jessica Lippen on viola, and George Teague on cello. The musicians are also all here with us and will be taking Q&A throughout the program. Everyone say hi. I also wanted to mention, you can use the YouTube chat feature to the right of the video, or I think below the video if you're on mobile. We'll be pulling questions from that for Q&A. So if you have a question at any point through the broadcast, throw it in there and we'll try to get to it when we do the Q&A with the program. Also, I wanted to mention in the comments section of the YouTube video, I posted the program for tonight. I think you have to click read more to see the whole thing. But if you want to get a sense of where we are in terms of which video is which, you can follow along there as well. A quick note about what you're seeing and hearing. So what we saw and heard was a graphic score. And what that means is that musicians used that animation as a guide to make music. So whereas in a more traditional composition, musicians would be looking at half notes and whole notes and time signatures, very specific symbols that tell them what to play. In this case, their only guide is that video that you saw. So that is an invitation to interpretation, of course, and a lot of what we'll be talking about will be what does that mean, and how does a musician decide to create music in a particular way based on a score like that. This project was co-conceived with a composer, Danny Clay, in San Francisco, as a way, since we can't be together in real, for real, with musicians blowing into their instruments all in the same room, we can still share in music making by using these animations as a guide, and then sharing that music with each other and then with you all. So we're really excited to share that with you this evening. We do have a blog post about graphic scores and about the project based on an interview with Danny Clay and with a number of the musicians. So we'll put that in the YouTube chat as well. Check out the blog post if you're interested in learning a little more. For today's presentation, we've collected 4 animated scores that we'll be showing with you. 2 by Joseph Colombo and 2 by Byron Au Yong, both actually San Francisco-based composers. And for each of those 4 scores, we're going to share 3 interpretations of that score with you. For one of the interpretations, and this was actually the interpretation we saw, musicians independently decided how they would interpret the animation. For a second interpretation of each score, our being an orchestra means we play together as a group, right? So we got the musicians together on a Zoom call, and they discussed how we might interpret each score. So we'll also share with you an interpretation that's based on that group consensus from all the musicians. And then a little bit later in the program, we're going to share with you a live interpretation by one of our performers. So now I'm going to share with you a another interpretation of the same score by Joseph Colombo. What I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to play it silently for you first. As you're watching, think about what it might mean to interpret that score musically. So think about that as you're watching it silently. And then following the silent playback, there will be a short pause, and then you will hear our second interpretation of that same score, which is the interpretation that our musicians created together as a group. Unmute myself there. That was our second interpretation of Joseph Colombo's score. The score is called Analog. And again, that was an interpretation that the musicians discussed ahead of time and created as a group. I'm going to share with you now a second score by Joseph Colombo. This one is called Gracefully Unconfined. And I'll do the same thing. I'll share with you first one playback where it's silent and think about what a musical interpretation might mean. Following that, you will hear CCO's individual interpretation where musicians each decided how they would interpret. And then following that, you will hear our group interpretation. So we'll play the score 3 times. That was Gracefully Unconfined by composer Joseph Colombo. Joseph's on the call with us, and I'd like to ask a couple of questions. I guess first of all, for both of these scores, what talk a little bit about your inspiration and also your technique for making the animation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first off, thanks for doing this and thanks for having us. Such a wonderful project. I've been exploring animated graphic scores for a little bit. I always kind of keep a staff there, just so everybody understands, kind of what's going on. We get that it's music, and I drew these out all by hand, frame by frame, sort of just the classic animation style. The second one, which we just heard, was digitally doing that sort of on an iPad. The first one we heard and saw was actually my first attempt at doing something like classic on paper frame by frame animation. So yeah.
And Joseph was kind enough to send me the originals of that score, which I can hold up here. It's really, now we can kind of see, there we go. So and then did you stop motion animation to create the video out of these? Is that the?
Well, I mean, I guess stop motion refers to doing something frame by frame, and that's what animation is. So each one of those is, strung together at a certain timing, and that's what gives you that effect.
Cool. Alan, I'll hand it over to you to ask.
Sure.
The audience.
Thanks, Randall. I had a question for Joseph, or maybe a couple of them. So these are all hand drawn. Tell me, how many frames per second did you how many drawings per second did you make for these?
Well, for the first one, for the analog, I think it was like 24 frames total or so. And they were going along at a couple different rates. I forget the frame rates after doing it. I sort of just adjust it to whatever visually is the most engaging. The second one, the Gracefully Unconfined, I believe that might have been in the neighborhood of 100 or so frames. And then again, just, finding whatever rate made the animation come alive the best.
I see. And tell me, in the first piece, this analog, the smear, how many frames were there total? Just curious.
There was like around 20 or 24.
There were. Wow, it's amazing how subtle really that is, because there's so much similarity to them, but there's clearly a lot of variety. So I was curious about that. Joseph, thank you so much for doing this. And I love these scores. I love what everyone did with these scores. I would love to begin by asking Sean, since we heard at the very beginning of this broadcast your interpretation of analog, that was some pretty crazy clarinet sounds. Tell us a little bit about how you did that, what you were aiming for, and how you accomplished it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Alan. In the very first video that we heard with the kind of smear, that was actually a clarinet sound. I know that might be hard to tell because I didn't play the clarinet the way that you traditionally hear it. Since the music was inspired kind of by traditional Western notation, but with the smear coming across it, which is not traditional, I thought maybe I could make a sound in my instrument that is also not traditional. So instead of putting a reed on a mouthpiece, like what a clarinetist would normally do, I buzzed with my lips just into the horn like this to kind of create that sound. And it's using my very Western instrument, but maybe in a way that's not making Western sounds. Does that answer your question, Alan?
Indeed, that was. Honestly, one of my favorite aspects of that performance was the very first reaction of, what instrument is that exactly, and how is he doing that? Like, what an interesting, and then as it became more obvious it was a clarinet being played with, alternate techniques. What was the technique? And so that's great. Thank you, Sean. Now we saw a number of other performances of these pieces. Let's talk a little bit about the second one, Gracefully Unconfined. And there were a lot of different things going on here, obviously, in the performance that included everyone. We talked in our rehearsal about drawing this piece together with, here are some of the ideas that we came up with, just so that all the audience knows. Mozart vibes, right? There was something sort of naive, or in a positive way, naive, uplifted. And another phrase we had from that rehearsal was childhood learning of instrument, which I thought was really interesting. The idea of the trying to reflect the freedom of the gesture sort of springing around the staff in all the various ways that we did. And we left this one really open in terms of pitch materials. We said to everyone, choose your own key, chromatic moments, pitch bends. The idea was that pitches would be very free, and we were just going for this kind of character. So especially for the folks we heard a lot of notes from, the flute, the piccolo. Dalia, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you did there? Were you playing any particular scales or any collections of notes, or totally random? What were you doing?
Sure. Yes, so I was definitely coming out from the discussion, from everybody's discussion of childlike, all those sounds. I was, well, in the piccolo is already easy enough to be very agile, like to be very like flexible with those fast notes. So I was trying to be as transparent as possible with fingerings, like fast fingerings, like scale like. Not, I was trying to avoid going towards some sort of tonal or even atonal. Like I was just trying to look for patterns within the fingerings, like with the contour of the fingerings, like going through the piccolo for sure, and trying to be as crystal clear as possible. Which, you know, it comes from that feeding from everybody's like comments and your guidance, like during the discussions.
Thank you, Dalia. And it was interesting, the variety of ideas. I think especially in that group performance of the Gracefully Unconfined. George, tell us a little bit about what you did there, because it was so utterly different from what Dalia and Leslie did. And honestly, when I first heard you, it struck me. I remembered immediately the pretty diatonic melody, sort of folk sounding melody at the end of Firebird. It reminded me of a little bit. I didn't know if there was anything specific you were thinking of there, but it certainly had that simple diatonic sort of folk music quality. What were you doing?
Well, I wanted it to be in a key. So I said to myself, okay, I'm going to pick D major and I'm going to stick with that. So I quickly thought of a little melody that would last a few bars. And then I sort of turned it into a theme and variations, because we were sort of reflecting on the childlike quality of this score. And I was thinking, okay, so we have our theme here, which is going to be the most basic one. And then it sort of evolves into this different creature, as you would find in a theme and variations. And it was a lot of fun to see exactly where the theme could go with the score.
Thank you, George. It is really interesting to see how everyone's playing changes as these animations repeat. And I think one of the most interesting aspects for me is what the performers choose to change through the repeats of these animations. Are they? And initially, when we were starting this project, I thought, well, it would make sense if the player feels that this should mean the same thing, and you would play the same thing each time. Now having done a couple of weeks of this and having seen a lot of these, I see why obviously it's more interesting to try and include some variety there. But it's just interesting how people decide to create that variety? How about someone we haven't heard from yet here? How about Becca?
Hello.
Tell us about how you, what were your thoughts, and how did you adjust what you did from through the repeats of the animation?
So initially, my first idea was chromaticism, because to me, the time I felt most free in my musical journey, it's like the moment before you know too much, like you know enough to play the instrument and you're really excited about it, but you don't know enough yet about how hard it's going to be or how long of a journey. So it's like kind of that in between a little bit. And I just remember when I was first learning the instrument, I mean, like in high school, early college, that era when I knew a lot, but not enough to really know a lot. The coolest thing was chromaticism and like really fast notes. So I did that for a while, and then I was like, oh, I should probably use something different because I'm kind of doing the same thing. And then I was like, you know what? I'm gonna do some pitch bends, and I just like moved my instrument to the contour of the melody a little bit. So that's how I chose to add some variety to it.
That's really interesting. And Joseph, tell me now, having heard all of this, what do you feel about what came out of your scores? Was this anything like what you'd imagined, or if it, how did it surprise you?
I mean, all of the above. It was such a wonderful experience. It was wonderful hearing the different things, obviously that people bring to it. That's always a pleasure in classical music, and I think the opportunity of the ambiguity of the graphic score just heightens that. I loved hearing you guys. I mean, who's not going to blush over a comparison to Mozart in one of their works, right? And just like the childlike nature of everything, and trying, working hard to get it have that feeling. It was so wonderful, the different ways it spurred in everybody and how those all complement to each other with the performance as well. With both of the scores, it's always something so much deeper and more intricate than you would first think or imagine.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's thinking of the piece as Mozartian in character. I think, what does that really mean to me? I think of Mozartian in the sort of duality between Mozartian and Beethovenian. One is struggle and one is just free, sort of free playing of the idea as they come. And I mean, this was clearly there was a lot of really fantastic freedom of different types. Dalia, you had I mean, there's just so much interesting stuff going on in the things that you did. Do you want to say anything else about that? I mean, you have
Well,
oh, should we continue? I'm sorry.
Dalia, I think we'll actually hand it over to you. Dalia is going to join us and share a live interpretation of the two scores we heard, and also two scores by Byron Au Yong. Actually, we're going to start with the two scores by Byron Au Yong, and then we'll hear also the two scores we just heard, which Dalia will perform live for us.
Right, yes, and I can definitely complete your questions, Alan.
Wow. Sorry, Vandal, go ahead.
I was going to ask, and Dalia, I know you had a question from Alan, but I have to ask, we saw, I think, 3 different instruments between the 4 pieces and a lot of really interesting sounds. Could you talk a little bit about the instruments you were playing and also how you made some of those really cool sounds?
Sure. Yeah, and it goes definitely with what I was talking about, the sessions. So I use the alto flute, which is in G, actually, transposing instrument. I use the bass flute, which is in C, still. And for the last one, I use the piccolo, for sure. Yeah, and as for the sounds, the techniques that I chose to use, that reflected kind of what I was interpreting, I use a lot of vocal freight and the, the third movement. I definitely like to include my voice as part of projecting some of the ideas that I always have on the scores or in improvisation in general. I definitely use a lot of airy, like overblowing airy tones, creating overtones. I like to incorporate also breathing as part of the improvisation textures that I use. Just breathing in and out and trying to externalizing my breathing as well. What else? I think for the most part, yes, I use a lot of consonant playing in my last one, like pairing the pointillistic styles of the graphic score.
Dalia, whenever I hear you play, I am not only struck by the tremendous energy you bring to what you're doing, but I feel like I'm always learning a little bit more about what the various flutes can do. And this brings me, it was just a couple of years ago, we were playing your brother Pablo's concerto and had a lot of very similar, relatively extreme effects. And it's just fascinating to me how you incorporate them into your musical output, into the ideas that you eventually settle on. Tell us a little bit about your inspiration with this stuff. Are there particular players that you think of, or is it completely outside the world of the flute that you're thinking of when you come up with these ideas? Where do they spring from?
Sure, Alan. Funny enough, like these past weeks, I have been very forced to think of this, like in retrospect, because I have been invited to other talks about the same thing. I do definitely come from. It's not coming just out of the blue, like in me. I do definitely like go back into all the experiences of composers that I have had the opportunity to interpret or collaborate through the years. Like definitely a lot of things, like like I have. I mean, it comes like in the 70s, like 80s, like a lot of these composers, like even in the 50s, like collaborating with these magnificent flutists. So it's not really. I think the flute has so much trajectory into developing and, crossing those boundaries and just pushing those expectations. So yeah, definitely collaborations, and just like by getting to know more repertoire. And yeah, there are like a lot of flutists that I have been seeing. I mean, like Claire Chase is one of the great ones, like Chicago, for a long time that she was in Chicago, that I was looking up to, you know, and all these things. But yes, it's definitely a combination of many experiences throughout years.
You know, Dalia, it's so fascinating. And I was thinking as you began to answer Randall's question and you were still a little out of breath from all that work, it seems unfair to make you immediately have to talk after doing all of that. Because the flute, and especially the big flutes, the alto flute, the bass flute, take a lot more air than most instruments. I think a lot of people don't realize, while the oboe takes such a tiny bit of air, and the hardest thing is being able to, you know, get rid of the old air and get oxygen into your body so you can continue. The flutes, and especially the big flutes, are the opposite of that. And tell me one other question about how you interpret these scores. We talked a little bit last time about the nature of the graphic scores and how the difference between these graphic scores and what we consider a conventional score is not a difference of type, it's a difference of degree. That all of these musical languages are non-specific to some degree. And I'm curious how much, when you interpret a graphic score like this, how much of it is purely abstract based on the feeling you get from the piece, and how much of it is elemental details that you pick up from the, you know, specific things that you try and work in some way?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think in this, like, you know, I feel like the scores that are notated, you know, traditionally, like, and even the scores that I have approached, like with I even like further notation into extended techniques and to, you know, even, you know, multi staffs and everything. They have the information there, they have the instructions. It's like kind of reading a manual, right? You have all the instructions. As for these scores, like it was actually exciting to get to talk about this within the group, because this is about discussion, this is about concept, this is about this pushes us like to actually like put some like adjectives in there, put some like process of thinking, like that goes into, you know, like that intuitiveness, like that, going into, you know, being a little intuitive about like, oh well, you don't have like really the written traditional information, you have like contour, you have like texture, you have colors for some of them, you have movement. So you grab all those elements and you can make up your instructions. I think, like, you know, from the discussion that I was part of for the group and for my interpretations when I was in the group, I was keeping that faithful to that discussion. And then when I go on my own, I actually prioritize certain other aspects that I find it like, oh, this is an aspect that I actually feel is the most important. So I go about information, but also about intuition in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
So
Randall,
cool.
go ahead, please.
Excuse me, Dalia, that's so cool. Excuse me. Well, speaking of our group interpretations, I do want to share a few more interpretations of Byron Au Yong's scores with you. These two scores are actually a pair, as you may have noticed with Dalia's interpretation. One is called, you can read it as C6D, or maybe like a weird spelling of COVID, / upper hemisphere. And then the second is the reverse of that, D4C, or the lower hemisphere. I'm going to play first both of these scores back silently. You'll see one and then the other both silently. And then I'll play both of them with the musician's individual interpretation. And following that, you'll see both of them with our group interpretations.
So, Randall, before we do that, I just, if it's all right, if no one minds, I just wanted to ask Byron real quickly about the titles of these pieces and what they mean.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Yeah, C hyphen, it's Roman numeral VI and then D, so it looks like COVID. And then there's the reverse of that, the D for C. And as a composer, as many composers are fond of letters relating to the work. This was, our deadline was May 8th. And so we were sheltering in place. The pandemic, which is still ensuing, was in place. And so this is the opportunity.
So it's sort of a play on COVID, and of course, one is the reverse of the other.
Yes, except what I realize is that the scores are actually inversions, not retrograde. But I'm not sure how to invert the letters for the title.
We can work on that for the second edition, right?
Yes.
All right. Sorry, Randall.
No, that's fine. Thank you. That's really cool to hear. So again, I'm going to play this back silently. And for everyone watching, think about how you might interpret that musically. And then following that, you will hear CCO's individual interpretations and then CCO's group interpretations. Really interesting stuff there, huh?
Right?
So I want to mention, again, you're hearing musicians from the Chicago Composers Orchestra, Dalia Chin on flute, Becca Dora on oboe, Sean Flynn on clarinet, Yvonne Garcia, violin, Jessica Lippin on viola, and George Teague on cello. We will get to Q&A in just a second here. I also want to mention a couple ways for everyone listening in that you can be involved in this project. First of all, this is a program that we're streaming freely, but if you like what you see and hear, please consider making a donation that would support our musicians and our programming. And if you give $25 or more, you'll actually get a personalized animation, personalized graphic score animation with performances recorded alongside of it. Also, you can make music with us. We've posted last week's videos on YouTube silently, and we'll do the same this week. And we are extending the invitation for everyone who's interested in participating to create your own interpretation of these videos, which we will then mix into a final sound and graphic score collage that we will share at the end of the project. So you don't have to be a professional musician. If you are, great. If you want to get a noisemaker and hum or sing or bang along with us, then please do. I think that can be a lot of fun. And Byron, of course, is here. And Byron, I guess I'll start out by asking you a little more about your production technique for these videos. And then Alan, I'll hand it over to you for more questions.
Byron, would you tell us a little bit about how you created these scores? What was your technique? Was this
totally? Yeah. So first of all, thank you so much. The imagination of this project is so fantastic because it actually can exist outside of this pandemic, right? And so I want to put that out there. Also, this is my first animated score. And I think in line with that, in line with the title, I think as an early composer, there was very much an interest of right, BACH, like thinking of those notes and what I could do with that. And so a lot of the process for this was thinking, okay, I'm doing something that I actually want to continue. Like like what an amazing way to think about gesture, right? Silent gesture that then is interpreted by musicians. And the parameters were so great that Randall and the Chicago Composers Orchestra initially sent, because one of them was the animation alone should guide interpretation. So no extra program notes, no instructions, right? No specification of solo or, right? So everything had to be contained within the movement of this score. And so the specific question is what was my technique? So as this is my first animation, what I did is actually took a stock animation, and then thinking of the pandemic, I thought, how can I make this ill? What filters can I apply to continually sicken this? And the animation is the world, our globe, and so the process was to continue to figure out a way to have the world burn and be flooded, and all these things were so. And then one of the other parameters is you have to do two of them, and so there's hence the upper hemisphere and lower hemisphere. And I think it's so applicable now, right, where human rights are being violated, especially in the United States, as they are globally, as they are eternally. And to be thinking also of our place as musicians who practice a form that is a colonized form. I mean, I can go on, but yeah, so the upper and lower hemisphere is definitely to address that as well.
That is great, Byron. And I will tell you now that this is over, when we're having the meeting about how to create these things, one of the things I try and keep in mind is how much how many rules we should create for the joint interpretation that will, you know, give us enough limitation to aid creativity, but not so much that it stifles the creativity. And I will tell you, the first thing I thought when I saw your video was when I make a sazerac and you start with the absinthe drip and light that up. Oh my gosh, isn't that funny? Now, I couldn't say that before we'd done all that, because then it's hard not to think of that. But I just really enjoyed that, and especially now hearing what you had in mind when you did it was fantastic. Thank you so much. I would love to talk to some of the performers about this, and we haven't heard from Yvonne or Jessica yet. Yvonne, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you felt here, what you were trying to do?
Yes, so it was really interesting working with these graphic scores, especially, at least myself, I submitted the individual portions before we actually had a rehearsal. So it was interesting to see how those actually were able to match other musicians' individual portions as well. It's just been a great collaboration.
Jessica, what do you think?
Oh, well, I had a lot of fun with this. I miss playing with other people, and anytime that I've done anything like this before, I've been like, it's been a collaborative process where we're all bouncing or in the moment interpreting the graphic score at the same time. So yeah, I found that with this, I loved bringing out just lots of smoky sounds with sweeping harmonics and kind of distortion, that sort of thing.
You know, it's one of my favorite things about this project, and we touched on this last week just a bit, is the really kind of freewheeling nature of this. And it's one of my favorite things about working with Chicago Composers Orchestra, that we are a group of people who are able to approach such abstract projects with no judgment, with no limitation. You know, one of my favorite things about us as a group is that people are open to anything. And I think back to my first concert as music director of CCO, when we opened the program with a sort of gallery of performance art from Yoko Ono's Grapefruit. And I thought, how many places in the world could I do something like this with people who love doing this like this? And it's just so much fun. So I don't know, that wasn't really a question. I just wanted to say that how much I love and miss everyone, and enjoy that we can do all of this. Please, Randall.
In the chat that I wanted to throw out, one I could answer was on how we determine the instrumentation choices. So I guess I'll give you a two-part answer to that. Up front, we divided up the musicians in the orchestra into these groups of 5 or 6 people that would balance out the different instrument groups. So in each session, each week, there's a couple string players, a couple wind players, brass players, and so on. So that was one way. But then after everyone submitted their recordings, we mixed them all together. So there was some curation involved on the part of those of us who were doing the sound mixing. But I have to say that I was expecting there would be a lot of sort of editing involved, and there really wasn't, which was a bit of a surprise to me. Like, things just kind of worked. I guess because everyone was watching these same scores, so there was a little bit of like fade in or out or something here or there, but for the most part, not a lot, which I found kind of interesting. And then someone had a question on how to submit your own interpretations. There is a video on our YouTube channel. The title is "Here's How to Make Music with Us." So when you're finished with this live stream, you can check out our channel homepage, and you can just play that video. It gives instructions at the very beginning. There's also instructions in the description for that video. It's basically as simple as recording yourself and then emailing us the recording. So please do make music with us.
Please do.
Well, we are at time here at 8:30. Alan, thank you. Byron, Joseph, thank you. And to all our performers, thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Randall, Byron, Joseph, all the performers. Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone who's watching. Don't forget to join us next week. We're doing this again at 7:30.
Thank you, Alan, for reminding me. We have 2 more releases left, next week at 7:30, and then the following week also at 7:30. So please tune back in.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.